Thanks, guys. Thanks, Ned. Great introduction. I think you threw a lot of stuff out that these guys will want to address. And wow, I almost need, this is a beautiful space. I almost need sunglasses up here. Again, thanks to Toyota for having us. I want to introduce Julie Brill to my left, FTC Commissioner, and as she's been called the most important voice on privacy on the Commission. And I would dare to say probably one of the most busy people on the Commission.
Very busy, yes. Yes, we're very busy.
We're flying out to Amsterdam later today.
In a few hours.
Yes, okay.
Yes.
And Brian Schatz next to her, who is joining us at a interesting moment in the Senate, sort of this pregnant pause before you return to deal with the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act.
Good to see you.
Good to see you, thanks. So we'll talk about that as well and other things the Senate's doing and can do in the area of connected vehicles, devices, sensors, and all the things that are collecting data on all of you and all of you as you sit here. And in fact, I think some of you may have driven over in a Toyota. Who knows what was collected on you on the way? So we'll figure that out too. So Julie, we'll start off with you.
Sure.
Where do you see the IoT landscape going? Where is it now? And just sort of set the stage for us, big picture.
Sure. And but first of all, thank you to Passcode, thank you to Toyota, thanks Mike, thank you Ned. For inviting me here. It's an incredibly important conversation, and I'm delighted to be speaking with the Senator about these issues, who's been a real leader on so many important consumer protection issues. Internet of Things. We are in a world right now, we've got 25 billion sensors in the world now. 25 billion. Just want to repeat these numbers so everyone can kind of absorb them. Pretty soon, in 5 years, it's thought that the number of sensors will grow to 50 billion. That is, they will double. These sensors are everywhere, not only in wonderful Toyota cars. I will confess, all of our cars are Toyota cars in my family. Just so happens.
I'm a little bit concerned about the amount of Toyota owners there are on the stage. Actually,
that could be. Are we all? All? Yeah. And I've got 2 teenage sons, so we're talking 4.
It was not a plant.
It was definitely not a plant. Definitely not a plant. But so cars, homes, streets, clothing, as was alluded to, as Ned and others alluded to. So we're talking about a lot of information flowing. At this point, people estimate we're talking 16 trillion gigabytes. I think that's more than most people can actually fathom. Certainly it's more than I can fathom. I think there are probably some experts here who can figure out what that really means, but we're talking about a lot of data. But it's also thought that this amount of data, because of the number of sensors, are likely to double every 2 years. So we're talking about a tremendous amount of data now and a tremendous growth in data over time. The potential for this data is enormous to do a huge amount of good when you think about it. So a lot of this data, if it's used appropriately, could help solve some huge societal problems, whether it's health, the information that we could gather from wearables, from Fitbits and watches and things like that, to flow into research to try to just solve some of the intractable health problems that we have, whether it's diabetes or obesity or other things. Transportation, the ability of this information to really solve some of the huge gridlock problems that we have, or energy consumption. How can we make our automobiles and our other transportation more efficient? Education, the potential benefits are enormous. And I spend a lot of time speaking about those potential benefits, but we probably also need to turn to some of the concerns. And because this information coming from sensors is going to be deeply sensitive and deeply personal, there really are some important concerns that we need to focus on. So the FTC did a report that came out at the beginning of this year, the Internet of Things report. I see many people here in the audience who participated in our workshop. We brought in all forms of stakeholders, policymakers, industry, consumer advocates, lots of researchers to come in and talk to us about the Internet of Things and about what some of the potential benefits and some of the concerns were. Actually, Vince Cerf was our keynote speaker at that event, which was really kind of cool. And what we ended up focusing in on in our report were two buckets of concerns. Security, and security is a huge issue when it comes to connected devices, and then also privacy. So at a very high level, when we're talking about security of the Internet of Things, you're talking about not only the data being secure, but also the devices themselves being secure. As your colleague referred to the hack that was recently publicized with respect.
The Chrysler.
Right, the Chrysler Jeep that was hacked into, and that was remotely. So it wasn't hacked into kind of in a near field mechanism, but it was actually quite remote, which I think for most people was frightening. But that actually had been demonstrated. There was a proof of concept that had been demonstrated years ago. So I think this just got a little bit more publicity. So we're talking about lots of sensitive data. Companies, I'm going to move to security writ large though. Lots of sensitive data. A lot of companies, and this is not Toyota, this is not necessarily the other car manufacturers, but a lot of companies are involved with connected devices and collecting this data who aren't really accustomed to dealing with security of data. They might not be as sophisticated as the software firms or the other internet or the tech firms that have been dealing with security issues for a long time. So that's something that we pointed out as a deep concern to us. Hewlett-Packard did a study and found that 70% of the information that's flowing from connected devices is personal. That is, it is personally identifiable or linkable to individuals. And 90% is personal or linkable, and 70% of that is flowing over unencrypted networks. So thinking about the security issues is really something that's deeply important and something that we want manufacturers to focus in on. The other problem is some of these devices, again, not cars, but other devices like a connected pen, right, or a connected, piece of paper. These are not necessarily going to be devices that are going to be easy to patch. That is, the manufacturer might not have an economic incentive to push through patches. They'll just go to version 2.0, 3.0, or 4.0. So how do we deal with that economic equation about ensuring that devices that might not have necessarily a lot of sensitive data themselves, but could be a threat vector into other systems, how do we ensure that the patches are appropriately pushed through? So lots of issues around security of the data. It's the data and the device itself. Privacy, just really briefly. Some of the concerns are you're talking about devices. Again, let's say this is a connected pen. There's not going to be a user interface, or there may not be a user interface. So how do you inform consumers about what's happening to their data? How do you let them exercise any kind of choice? We've talked about the need to provide apps, immersive programs, immersive tools that might not exist on the device itself, but ways for consumers to understand what's happening with their data and to make choices. Yeah.
I want to bring the senator in.
Please, of course.
Because I know you've got a long laundry list of concerns.
I could go on, but let's absolutely hear this.
So, reflecting on some of the things Julie's brought up, and sort of stepping back from a lawmaker's perspective, I mean, one thing we want to do here is thinking about the things she's laid out. Where can Washington fit in, or where are the things you see IoT going that maybe concerns you?
Well, first of all, thank you for doing this. Let me say this. I think that members of Congress, generally speaking, tend to be a little too declaratory in terms of public policy, and especially in spaces where they don't know what they're talking about. They tend to sort of overcompensate. So here's where we should start, which is that most members of the public and their representatives in Congress are only starting to begin to understand what IoT is at all. They get the sense that there may be, it probably starts with a Fitbit, maybe with your phone, maybe with something in your home having to do with managing devices, but that's about as far as the knowledge base goes. Not every single member of Congress, but we still have an educational process to go through. Add on that polarization and chaos that is specific to this period in American history. And then let's get to the kind of policy challenges. On the privacy side, one of the things that I've been grappling with is, what do your constitutional privacy rights under the First and Fourth and other amendments, how do they manifest themselves for my 11-year-old 20 years from now? If the Constitution is a document that is reinterpreted and is evolving, then what are my privacy rights? And the sort of FIPS standards having to do with informed consent and choice and even the security side of it, how durable is that 30 years from now? We were talking in the green room before we started, and to me it really is an open question to kind of imagine what statutory framework are we going to establish that allows consumers to make a choice? Because I could make a choice. You could tell someone that they, under the statute or even under the Constitution, have a choice to not participate in IoT. Well, for another few years, that's a choice. But in 20 years, that's not a meaningful, practical choice. And so how do you start to make policy that that recognizes that this framework that the FTC and some of the other regulatory agencies work under, or even the Commerce Committee, those assumptions that we utilize are going to be essentially blown up as we end up with 100 billion, 200 billion sensors in every aspect of life. And Toyota will do a great job with encryption. Toyota will do a great job with informing consumers of their opportunities. But a 3-person app shop is not going to have the organizational capacity to give you the kind of choice that you want, and all you need is one aperture. I mean, I don't know the technical aspects, but I get that as you walk across the street, it is not a meaningful thing to say to somebody 20 years from now if the point of IoT is that it's immersive, right? That as Eric Schmidt said, the internet will essentially disappear, that it'll be permissionless, that you could have a theoretical right to not participate in the American economy, right? But that's no right at all. And so how do these constitutional and statutory rights evolve? And I'll just say one last thing before we continue, and that is the Congress, to the extent that it's doing something, is sort of legislating either by personal experience or what I call by your reading binder. So we all get a reading binder, or we should, you get an article, right? And you go, oh, they remote hacked a Chrysler. There ought to be a law, right? Or I experienced something with my iPhone, or if it's in aviation, I experienced something on United Continental, and there ought to be a law. And the challenge with IoT is, to the extent that we're doing something in automobiles or in the smart grid space or wherever it may be, is that it's supposed to be the Internet of Things, and you can't pick one thing and sort of burrow into it and regulate it. And I mean, you could, but you will not establish a meaningful policy framework for this thing to thrive, to experience all the upside, but to understand that there are real risks.
And I think a couple of things there. It seems like what you're suggesting is, and I think what you've suggested is right. Perhaps there doesn't need to be IoT-specific regulation or laws, but something that talks about the bigger issues of privacy, collection, and correlation, and things like that. So I know that's sort of where you were going, right?
Yes.
Because if you think about, and the other interesting point, right? We're going to get to a point where there's no opt-in or opt out of this. We're all going to be in it, right? There's so many sensors and trackers all throughout the street, our lives, in our cars. So we're not going to really be able to participate unless we are somehow allowing our data to be tracked and correlated. So where does regulation go from there?
The senator made some excellent points, and our report, so the commission as a whole said we don't want IoT-specific legislation, leaving aside just cars or some other sector, connected refrigerators or whatever it is. But we do think that there need to be, just as you said, Mike, some baseline rules that deal with all kinds of sensitive information. So the recommendations that we've made include data security legislation, which I know is something that you've been working on and thinking quite a bit about. data broker legislation, which would deal with the information as it flows into entities that create profiles about individuals. And we can talk a little bit about that if you want to, but it's a particular area that's been of concern to me because it's a sector that is not visible to consumers, and yet it can be quite significant in terms of decisions that they want to make, transactions they want to enter into. The consumers get profiled and segmented in a way that may or may not be accurate, but this flow of information from the Internet of Things will clearly be part of that ecosystem. So that's the second recommendation. And then the third recommendation is baseline privacy legislation. You know, I actually think it's wonderful that you are thinking about legislation 20 years down the road, because when you look at the laws that we have on the books now, they are a couple of decades old at best, if not several decades, more than that. And at the time they were created, you know, dealing with health information, dealing with financial information, these were good laws. But now health information is not just limited to the doctor's offices and insurance companies and hospitals. It's flowing everywhere. I mean, health information could actually be derived from cars. It will certainly be derived from watches and Fitbits and whatnot. But it could be derived from all sorts of sensors. So how do we deal with that sensitive flow of information which doesn't fit within the 20-year-old or 30-year-old?
How is that?
scene?
I mean, I wonder whether, I think everything you're saying is correct, but I'm not sure that that's not legislating specifically to the IoT, except that maybe that's the third rail and causes certain members of Congress to be averse to talking about it, because there's this sense that, you know, that we ought not to regulate this thing that is so exciting, that has so much upside, and I get that. But one of the things that I've said is we should have a light touch, but not zero. I mean, we have to establish a framework, and I guess I'm a little more hawkish about admitting that what we're really talking about is the IoT and its transformational impact on our sense of what privacy is, on security issues, on the way we interact with each other, with our devices, the way commerce occurs. And that's all IoT. I mean, it sounds like you're working all those things through and suggesting all those things, but assiduously avoiding admitting that this is really about the Internet of Things and how it's going to change everything.
But so it is about the Internet of Things, but it's more than just the Internet of Things. It's about apps. It's about online searches. It's about everything.
It's about big data.
It's about big data and all the flows of data, which will include Internet of Things. And Internet of Things may become the biggest stream of data over time. But right now, a lot of this data is flowing just through apps and through online interactions. So it's bigger. If this is possible to imagine, it's actually bigger than the Internet of Things. It's really trying to find what are the fundamental principles that we want to focus in on wherever the data is flowing from. And so the concept behind a Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights or baseline privacy legislation are trying to really instill the FIPS, as you refer to them, is to figure out what is the sensitive information and how do we want to protect that? What kind of choices, if any, do we want to give to consumers, and what kind of protections need to be built into it? And this, can I just circle back to your point, which is we're not going to be able to have any choices,
Right.
and it's all out of consumers'
It is.
hands. So I want to push back on that a little bit. I think it is absolutely the case that companies and other entities do need to be thinking about privacy by design and security by design. We haven't really dived into the security issues, but those are really big, which means that that companies are really thinking about these things up front, and they're really doing, on the security side, security in depth. They're really thinking about not only technological security issues, but also social security issues. Sorry, that's small s,
Yes.
social security issues. So that consumers don't have to think about it. Security is very hard for consumers to deal with. We will get to, good authentication procedures, good passwords, double authentication and whatnot in a way that's seamless, but we're not quite there yet. Consumers can't really figure out security very well. On privacy, we absolutely need privacy by design, which means that companies are thinking about these issues up front. But having said that, I still think there needs to be transparency. Transparency plays a very important role. Consumers can make choices, but also researchers can figure out what's going on, and researchers can tell the public about what is happening. I am not as pessimistic that there will be no way to inform consumers or the public about what's happening. I think when you think about the connected home, the Wall Street Journal, sorry about mentioning
okay.
the competition, the Wall Street Journal did a really interesting article last year in connection with the Consumer Electronics Show and talked about how companies are actually competing to design the command centers in homes. So all the connected devices that are going to be existing in homes will be controlled at some point in time, probably by one command center. So companies are trying to be that command center to provide it. That command center will not only serve as a great tool to control devices, but it will also be a wonderful place to inform consumers about data flow. So there are going to be ways that this can happen, but we need to start being creative
Can
about
you
it.
explain to me how that, I'm a consumer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where, and it's 20 years from now, and I get into my Toyota.
You won't be driving it. It'll
My
drive
fuel
itself.
cell, yeah, my fuel cell hoverboard Toyota, and or I turn on my TV.
Yeah.
When do I get my choice?
In that instance, I would hope, and I think actually that the auto manufacturers are doing this, is when you first get your car, when you first turn it on, you're given information. It'll be, 20 years from now, it'll be on the screen. It'll be on your dashboard, or it might be a hologram type thing that's actually on your windshield. And it'll say, okay, we can take your driving data and we can give it to your insurance company. Do you want that to happen? Do you not want that to happen?
But you're also assuming that people are going to read these and they're going to be written in some kind of English that we can understand.
Absolutely. So listen. We all know that privacy policies are, the 50-page, longer than Hamlet privacy policies are completely useless for your average consumer. We use them, and meaning we, the FTC, regulators use them. Privacy advocates use them. So I do think there's still a place to have in one spot a full description of what's happening with data. But no. We need to absolutely be thinking about giving consumers information in a way that is useful, that's just in time, that's short information, using icons, using quick words. And if consumers want more information, they can get it, or they can say, okay, I'm cool. I don't need any more
But that's like the Gmail, I agree. I mean, I don't see how that is a meaningful choice for the vast majority of consumers who want to get on with their lives, who want to maximize the benefit of whichever device they're using. And by the way, the disclosure, if you want to call it that, will likely say, oh, by the way, if we share this data with your insurance company, you may get a lower rate, right? I mean,
So
you're going to make trades, and I guess as a matter of public policy, I get how that's better than nothing, but it seems to me the vast majority of consumers are going to make the trade that forfeits what we would consider to be the sort of baseline standard for privacy that everybody has now. I think 30 years from now, my son is going to say, yeah, that's fine, whatever, take it. It's all on the internet. And so, which is, I don't think that's your fault. I don't think that's policymakers' fault. I just think that as we start to make policy, my concern is how do we get in front of this to sort of stop the slide and to empower consumers sufficiently that it's meaningful, because the IoT to me is so overwhelmingly positive, but it's also, even if you don't agree with me that it's so overwhelmingly positive, it's like the weather. I mean, you don't get to be opposed to the Internet of Things. It's going to happen. And so the question becomes, what does my son expect in terms of his constitutional or statutory privacy rights? I don't know the answer to that, but I know that he's going to click yes.
So I actually want to push back on that,
Okay.
because I don't think that that's. There is that vision, and there are a lot of people who share your vision. But I see something different happening in the economy today, and I see something different happening with kids. I think right now there's actually a lot of competition on privacy. There are a lot of firms that are trying to differentiate themselves by saying, we are going to be privacy protective. We're not going to let your information be out there in the, to be snarfed up by whoever wants to gather it. And just to your point about how will consumers interface, I mean, right now, there might be some choices that consumers aren't making because they're not given in an immersive, easy-to-use way. But think about your apps that might pop up and say, okay, this and your operating system will say on your smartphone, this app wants to collect your geolocation. Is that okay? I don't know about you, but I always say no. because I know what happens with that information. So whenever I'm given a choice, I say no. Just today, I don't know, I don't want to mention too many companies' names, but there was a big merger that took place, and there was a notice that appeared on a lot of people's inboxes today about whether or not you wanted to allow certain information to be used for marketing purposes as a result of that merger. I went onto the site that they provided, the link they provided you. It was very easy to opt out of, incredibly easy. So, okay, I may be an unusual consumer. I'll admit that. But there are, I think, a lot of people who can exercise these choices. But but to your point about kids, you know, again, and thinking about the competition that is taking place with respect to privacy, kids might want to keep their information right now, as if they're teens, private from their parents or private from their teachers. But there is absolutely there is a ton of evidence that kids are interacting much more with apps and tools that provide them with ephemerality and privacy as they see it than they are using apps and tools that don't provide that. When you think about Snapchat, when you think about Whisper, when you think about WhatsApp, these are privacy-enhancing apps, and that's why the kids are going to them. So maybe I'm just an optimist. Maybe I have to be since I've been doing this for over 20 years. But I do see a lot of competition taking place with respect to privacy. And frankly, I think that the more that the public becomes aware of things like data broker profiles or the types of information that's available about them, the more concern there will be, and that's why companies are responding, and they will continue to respond.
Before we move on, because I think this is a very interesting point of contention, it's not so much that I see it pessimistically in the future. I just see it differently in the sense that I don't think it's a tragedy that my son will have a lower threshold for what he considers to be private. I mean, I don't think it's a tragedy that he lives online. I think, you know, I have to manage it as a father and all the rest of it. But I think it just is. And I think that that regulatory bodies and policymakers have to imagine a future where it is not catastrophic, that the vast majority of our information is in public. And I agree with informed consent. I agree with empowering consumers. But it just occurs to me that it's not as though he's going to be walking around with no privacy and upset that I didn't legislate to get in front of that. I think that his generation will say, of course, I've been living online in the same way that you've been living in the world for as long as I've been alive, and that's okay. So my own view is that we have to imagine not just the future in terms of how this thing operates, but the future in terms of the people's expectation and their definition of privacy, because I think these Fourth, and Fifth Amendment rights are going to be evolving. But that may get a little more philosophical.
You have to admit there's an evolving sense of privacy, right? What we considered private 20 years ago is not private today in some ways, right? So,
that's a pretty broad question.
So then, but that's what you're saying, right? Because we all know, I think we all agree that Congress isn't the most imaginative group, right? So, sorry, no offense, but so how can you come up with law that sort of imagines what this thing is going to be in 5 years? So are you saying that you might as well just give up or just let this thing play out and then?
So let me give you some examples of where I think this will head in the future, and to maybe find some common ground with what the senator and I are talking about. I think what'll happen is as people discover that either this information flow, this deeply sensitive information flow, is going to be used to determine whether they're eligible for a job, or whether they can get a cell phone at a certain rate, or whether they can get loans or they find out about loans being offered at a certain rate through advertising, which will only be occurring through whether it's their sneakers or their smartphone, whatever it will be. If both offers are provided to them as well as decisions are made about them based on this data flow, people are going to start to wonder, well, hey, how come the senator got an offer of a loan that was at 3% and I only got it at 5%? what is so different about him, other than the fact that he's a very important person, but what is so different about his credit rating or the fact that he gets to see these offers and I don't get to see them? These are the precise kinds of targeted issues that we've been focused on at the FTC. We're not looking at the broad flow and saying, oh my gosh, and tearing out our hair. We're trying to focus in on what could really harm consumers and where are they going to be affected in a way that is meaningful. That's what we're thinking about. So it's not just eligibility decisions, but I think at some point we're going to really start talking about the offers that are provided to consumers as the venues for viewing offers becomes much narrower. The other thing that I think we haven't brought into this discussion yet and we absolutely need to think about are the potential impacts on discrimination and the potential impacts on categorizing people in ways, whether it's by race, by sexual orientation, by religion. Income then starts to get into the harm. No, it definitely, but it also starts to get into the harm. But these, the financial harm, excuse me. But these are precisely the kinds of things that we've been talking about in our data broker report. We're going to be at some point coming out with another report that puts together information that we gathered in a few additional workshops on big data, tools for inclusion or exclusion. We need to really be thinking, again, to your point, about not this broad, like, oh my gosh, it's too overwhelming, we can't do anything about it, but really honing in on these potentially significant issues, whether it's harm or whether it's fairness, which from my perspective, the discriminatory impacts really fundamentally go to fairness. I think that these are things that we absolutely need to think about, and I think your son is going to be just as concerned about it as my kids are and as their kids are, because these issues are not going to go away. They've been around for a long time. They're going to change in terms of how they present themselves, but they're going to absolutely be there going forward.
But aren't those issues, aren't those ripe even before IoT, sort of the credit rating agencies and
absolutely.
Eligibility and
absolutely.
and loans in low-income communities? All of that it's been, I don't mean to dismiss it, but it has been ever thus. And does the IoT make it worse?
Well, you're saying there's more data.
I think the IoT, correct.
It'll
worse.
Refine the techniques.
I would say that there will be much more information that will be flowing about individuals. The ability for predictive analytics to improve, for people to make determinations, whether it's through alternative scoring or through alternative financial products, the ability to make predictions about individuals will astronomically improve.
And you have some deniability,
yes,
too. And you have some deniability if you're the company, because you're not actually discriminating. You're just using an algorithm, right? It's one thing if you're at a bank and you're saying, sorry, you're not eligible. It's another thing if you have something that just spits out, banner ads and email just according to whatever your algorithm sets up.
Well, I hope nobody would actually say that to me. In a room where
why?
Because to simply say it's the algorithm and you're not responsible for it is just not going to it's not going to cut it.
And I think we've seen that algorithms can be written in sort of discriminatory. It all depends on how the algorithm is written.
Absolutely,
right?
and one of the recommendations that we are making in terms of at the very least best practices at this point is for companies to really understand the impacts of their algorithms. They need to understand whether or not there is a disparate impact in terms of the way that they are looking at their data. So for instance, here's the example I give, and frankly, this was an example that came out about 2 years ago in the Harvard Business Review. So companies, let's leave aside data brokers. Let's leave aside entities that may be providing this information to companies. Companies will be looking at their own data. They'll be engaged in big data analytics. They're going to look at who are the customers who are the troublesome ones, who are the ones that should go to the back of the line of the customer service telephone, that should be put on hold for a while, who should go to the front of the line, and that's all going to come from big data analytics. What this Harvard Business Review article said, and I believe was absolutely true, is you need to look at what happens once that big data algorithm runs. Are you sending all the Latino men to the back of the line? Are you sending black women to the front of the line? Is this having some kind of disparate impact? Companies, I think, can't be an ostrich about this issue. They can't stick their head in the sand and say, oh, it's the algorithm, everything's okay. They really need to see what the impact is. because at some point, not only is there potential liability issues, right, under our fair employment, fair lending, all sorts of acts along those lines. But just generally speaking, it is not a good practice for any company to be caught in that situation where they are having a disparate impact on a certain population simply because the algorithm told them to.
So we're going to get to questions in just a minute, but I do want to deal with two hot topics quickly and then move to questions. And first, safe harbor, how that impacts this space. I know you're going to Europe. You guys have been thinking a lot about that decision.
Absolutely. The senator was behind a big effort to write a letter with respect to that.
So what do you think? I mean, is that, and what's that going to do to this space, but also just the U.S. tech industry in general in regards to privacy?
Well, Senator Thune and I led a letter that I think 43 members of the House and Senate on a bipartisan basis sent, and it basically said, let's figure out the mechanics of how we're going to make a transition. I'll let Julie talk about the particulars because she's on her way to Amsterdam to fix all of this on behalf of the global economy. But I'll say that it joins the issue in the Congress in terms of our need to do cybersecurity, in terms of our need to address these issues more frontally. Again, I am one of these people who has avoided for my almost 3 years in the Senate. I have avoided talking about dysfunction because I think that's redundant, that's not informative to any of you. But in the last 3 weeks, I think I'd be crazy not to mention the fact that whatever policy issues are pending are totally on hold until the question of who's leading the House gets resolved. But I think from our standpoint, the raw politics of it is that it puts it right in front of us and forces us to address some of these issues. I mean, we've had a hearing about information sharing. We've had a hearing about informing folks about data breach, but these are disparate conversations. They're an hour and a half hearings. Members come in for 5 minutes and then they race off to the next thing. We have not grabbed this issue in the way that Julie has and stayed on it long enough to make meaningful public policy. And hopefully this will be the start of us being forced to do so.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think this decision, I was out in Silicon Valley last week. I'm heading to Europe, as you said, to participate in a conference of all the data protection commissioners around the globe. Last week in Silicon Valley, Representative Eshoo was on a panel with me. She hails from Silicon Valley, and she said that the decision that came out of the European Court of Justice, which is known as the Schrems case, was 7.8 on the Richter scale. And for San Francisco, that's significant because that is actually the size of the 1906 Great Earthquake, which killed 3,000 people and decimated 80% of the city. So we're talking about big. There were 4,500 companies that were participating in the safe harbor, which is what the European Court of Justice deemed to be invalid. They deemed that the European Commission's decision to allow safe harbor to be an adequate mechanism for transferring data between Europe and the United States, that decision was invalid. And so 4,500 companies are now trying to figure out what they need to do. These are not just the biggest companies that were involved in safe harbor, and there were some very large companies involved, but also some very small ones, small SMEs, talk about redundant, small and medium-sized enterprises. Lots and lots of the information was HR information, that is, it was about jobs and employing people. So we're talking about something that is significant on both sides of the Atlantic. Right now, the Department of Commerce and the European Commission are very much trying to determine whether or not they can put into place a more durable transfer mechanism that will satisfy some of the concerns that were raised by the court. I'm very hopeful that they will come to a conclusion. I've long called for two things. I've long said two things about safe harbor in Europe. Number one, it needed to be improved. It was 15 years old. It needed to be updated. It needed to be improved. And there were ways in which, frankly, there are ways in which the administration has already improved it, but there are other things that needed to be done to improve it. But number two, safe harbor was really, it was an easy target, but it was the wrong target. The focus in Europe was really always about national security. This all arose as a result of the Snowden revelations. Safe harbor is one transfer mechanism. There are other transfer mechanisms. They all have national security exemptions. Frankly, there are national security exemptions that run throughout European data protection law as well. So I believe that the Schrems decision, we've lost some things with respect to invalidating safe harbor, which I hope we can fix. We lost a tool where the FTC can actually enforce and protect not just U.S. citizens' privacy rights, but also European citizens' privacy rights, and we had 40 cases that we brought under safe harbor. So we've lost that. We've lost transparency. Safe harbor was actually a fairly transparent mechanism. Other transfer mechanisms are going to be much more cumbersome for companies, and it does put them in a hard place. But they're also, at the end of the day, much less transparent. So we've lost those things. And I'm really, as I said, hopeful that we will be able to replace it with a more robust transfer mechanism. But what we've gained, and I think this is important, and maybe we can, I can leave, if I leave folks with nothing other than this, I hope you take this away. Privacy in Europe is not about protectionism. There are a lot of people both within the Beltway and in Silicon Valley who have viewed what Europe has been doing, at least with respect to privacy, to be about protecting their homegrown industry and trying to disadvantage U.S. companies. That is not what this is about. They really care about privacy. It is a fundamental right. And we need to start, I think, shifting our frame in terms of how we deal with Europe so that we really grasp that. And I view this decision, the other benefit is I hope it is a wake-up call, because we're going to be moving, it's not just this decision which invalidated safe harbor, but in about 6 months, Europe will be implementing the new General Data Protection Regulation, which is going to incorporate all of this and much, much more. So we need to really, I'm thrilled to hear that the senator sees this as a moment where hopefully Congress will really start thinking about some of these issues and what we need to do at home here in the United States to improve privacy and to make sure that we can have these seamless data flows with Europe.
Okay, great. I know we've got some people asking questions. How about over here? Oh, sorry for the mic. And then, yep.
Hi, good morning. Dan Caprio with the Providence Group. So I wanted to go back to the beginning in our keynote, our discussion. So as a diehard Cubs fan, the most important, and
Surprised you even got up this morning.
This is relevant. Thank you. But you know, in Back to the Future 2, today is the day that the Cubs win the World Series. So, you know, being a Cubs fan is a way of life. But also it's also about, you know, taking the long view. And so with the Internet of Things, how do we begin to think about the long view? I mean, we're talking about, you know, the issues of the day. You know, whether it's legislation on smart cars, HHS last week issued, 500 pages of impenetrable regulation about electronic health records and mobile devices. We've got DoD and DFARS that are beginning to think about classified networks and supply chains related to the Internet of Things and all sorts of things. NHTSA. We seem to be, our agencies and departments seem to be colliding in a regulatory sense. And so, you know, do we need, and I know, Senator, you've done a lot of work on this, do we need a coordinated national strategy? Because, you know, the rest of the world seems to have one, and it feels to me like we're just sort of bouncing back and forth from one issue to the next. And if we need a strategy, then how do we get there?
Well, I think you're right. We need to take the long view. And let me just say a couple of things about some positive movement. The chairman of the committee, John Thune, is taking the long view, and he is in the great tradition of Commerce Committee chairs who works on, you know, he's a strong Republican, but he's just a practical person. He is just he's a bipartisan guy. He works in the art of the possible. There are times where, you know, I'm not able to support his view on something, but he is always looking for common ground. And to that end, Senators Booker and Ayotte and Fisher and I, on a bipartisan basis, have a little IoT working group. So that's some of the good news. the challenge right now, even within the working group, is this sense that is this false choice between this sort of heavy hand of premature overregulation and doing nothing and allowing the private sector to flourish, right? And that's the false choice that Democrats want to come in and fix something on behalf of consumers that, like I said, they read about in the Atlantic or whatever, or that they experienced themselves, or someone walked up to them and said, I got hosed by this company, there ought to be a law. So Democrats want to come in and fix it and make a law. And Republicans right now, their instinct is to say, this thing's flourishing, we got to push back against Democrats who want to ruin it, And the sweet spot is, let me just say it's not even a sweet spot. The vast gap between people who want to over-regulate and burrow into one particular challenge that already occurred and the people who want to do nothing is where we need to work, right? And I'm not going to be overly sanguine about where we are right now, but I think there is a lot of room for bipartisan cooperation in that space, as long as we can get Democrats to admit that this is going to be a challenge, this is going to take a while, we shouldn't over-regulate right away, and that we can get Republicans to admit that this is not something we should do literally nothing about, that this is going to take a new public policy framework to allow it to flourish. So that's the space that I think we're trying to create. I think we are, given the Commerce Committee's history and given the current composition of the Congress, we're on a 3 to 5 year time frame to make meaningful policy changes. But that's okay, because even in my view, even if we had the perfect public policy, we probably ought to see a few more cards before we create a statute.
Tom Goldberg with Lineage. Great presentation. Richard Danzig came out last year with a report from CNAS that basically said we live on a diet of poisoned fruit. And in an NYU commentary on the presentation of that report said that maybe we ought to hit the pause button with our software and hardware development so that we can begin to address the flaws before this environment gets away from us. That was preceded by a month by a McKinsey report that basically said that any company in the digital space going forward, if they wish to do so in the digital space, needs to reinvent IT entirely to avoid digital attackers. Both of these seem to suggest that we've lost the battle here, and that without some resets in terms of technology, we are going to find ourselves in a total disaster.
Wow.
So,
Julie, please.
Yeah, let me address that. Let me help you out here. Let me help you out here. I think what that's getting at is the security issues. I mean, the deeply troubling security issues as opposed to the privacy issues. Let me focus on that. Look, security is hard. There's absolutely no question that there are a lot of people out there who are very interested in grabbing the crown jewels that exist in these data troves. And they are crown jewels. There's a lot of information out there about consumers that can be used to harm them, or about companies that can be used to harm them. So what companies need to do, and one of the things that we talk about a great deal, is it's not something where you can set up an IT system and then walk away like everything's fine. Every day, security experts and the people within companies need to be examining what is happening to their data. It's like a nuclear arms race, right? You get better, you find hackers, you get rid of them, and then they get more sophisticated, and you've got to get more sophisticated. And it's just this this constant iterative process, which is why when we think about what is reasonable security, when we do our enforcement work, by the way, I should say, you're in the space of best practices. You're in the space of, what do we do to try to prevent really bad things from happening? When we come in with an enforcement case, we're not talking about companies that have been involved in like one hack or that have had one little problem. We're not looking for perfect security. We are looking for reasonable security. And a big part of what we look for in reasonable security is this precise iterative process where you're constantly examining what is happening and you're constantly revising your system to ensure that you're, as best as possible, avoiding a detrimental hack. But bad stuff happens. There are hundreds of companies that we've looked at that have been involved in breaches, and we've only brought to date 60 cases. So there's many, many companies that experienced a breach where we decided they had reasonable security, but bad stuff happens, and they dealt with it. They had a process for responding. They had a process for dealing with it. That, to me, is, at least, you know, from an enforcement perspective, what we need to expect. But I do think going forward, you are talking about an issue that is not, no one's going to be able to rest on their laurels. I have often heard it said by companies that have been in the IT space for a long time that new companies had it much easier than old companies, and this is going to your point about legacy systems, which is really what I heard, you know, what you were talking about. It is a lot harder to reconfigure legacy systems than it is to build something from scratch. Right now, if someone's designing a system, they have all the benefit of all the knowledge that, you know, that was gained beforehand about what to do and what not to do, and how to do security by design from the beginning. But even with legacy systems, I think there are definitely things that need to be done and that can be done, and that we just even from an enforcement perspective, obviously expect to be done.
So I think we have time for one more question, but I do want to get, I would feel remiss if I didn't ask you about CISA, which you'll return to the Senate in the next day or so to deal with that. Where do you stand on that?
Well, we're in post-cloture time, so we will vote on it after an hour after convening tomorrow on the motion to proceed. We haven't seen the manager's amendment yet. My understanding is that it has addressed many of the concerns of privacy advocates, and it sort of narrows the scope to just national security. And so I'm preliminarily satisfied, but I won't see the language until hopefully later today or first thing tomorrow. I don't know whether it's going to pass, and the practical aspect of this is that we're not sure that there's going to be a time agreement that will allow this to happen in time for us to dispose of this and ensure the full faith and credit of the United States government by the end of next week. So the practical aspect is that if it's Wednesday, we don't know what's happening yet. So by the end of tomorrow, we'll have a better picture of whether this legislation is likely to be at least passed by the Senate, if not actually enacted into law. Sorry, I can't give you more visibility, but it's Wednesday.
Sure. All right, well, one more. You had a question over here, and I think that'll be it.
Hi, Claude Martz with MWatch, FTC Watch. I wanted to ask both of them in terms of the issue of data breach that's been a subject that came up in the House earlier this year, and Chairman Thune talked about doing something on that. Do you have a sense as to whether there might be any movement on that particular issue this year or in the next couple of years? And also, Commissioner Brill, do you see the FTC doing anything more on that from a regulatory perspective, or is it now in Congress's hand?
Well, I think there's a possibility that we'll get data breach legislation. I guess my own personal view of this is that it's a sort of second order priority. We are talking about what happens after the breach. We're talking about informing consumers and others that there has been a breach. So there are legitimate policy questions about what the threshold is, how often to send. There are state statutes that govern a lot of this. So there's this kind of patchwork of laws, and so so I understand the importance of this, but it seemed to me that we were spending as much time talking about what happens in terms of informing an individual that there has been a breach as we were talking about how to prevent the breach in the first place. And that shows the kind of misplacement of priorities and attention that the Congress actually has. That sounded important and enabled us to have a hearing about making sure that we ensure privacy and security, but the truth is we were literally talking about what happened kind of at the tail end of the process.
I couldn't agree more. Look, if good data breach notification legislation were to be passed, I'd be supportive of it. But right now, there's 40 some 45 plus states that have that in place. There's a bit of a patchwork quilt, but companies have basically been able to figure it out. I think the much bigger issues deal with the security side. We have had a decision out of the Third Circuit that has affirmed that the FTC does have authority with respect to looking at this issue under our unfairness jurisdiction. So that's good. But I think that having a bill in this area that is data security could be helpful to sort of scope out what the nature of our authority is. But just really quickly, and I know we need to wrap up, on your point about what else the FTC is doing, listen, there are many common errors. There are many breaches and problems, vectors into systems that happen from common errors. It has been said out at Stanford when the president had a cybersecurity summit out there in February. I was talking to a bunch of the experts and they did a bunch of presentations. The cybersecurity experts believe that 80% of the threats, the hacks, are a result of 20 common errors in programming. So this struck us at the FTC as being, to a certain extent, a little bit of an education problem, that we needed to reach out to the app community, the developer community, and talk about how to do security on the ground. So we have a whole program underway. It began in Silicon Valley. We're doing one in Austin. We're going to be doing one in Seattle. We're moving to where, out of the Beltway and out to where the developers and the programmers are to talk about security issues. This effort's called Start with Security, and we're bringing in experts to reach the developing community where they are as opposed to where we are. I think that's an incredibly important way to try to resolve, these 20, at least the 20 common errors. At least we can do security hygiene. Is it going to solve everything? Absolutely not. There still will be very sophisticated hacks, and there are probably people here in this room that know an awful lot more about that than I do. So it won't solve everything, but it will solve some stuff. And that's where we think that we can play a role.
Well, great. We're out of time. I think that's a great way also to segue to our next group. Thanks to Julie Brill.
Thank you.
Thanks to Senator Schatz.
Thank you. It was great.
Thanks. Moving right along, we'll bring up the next group. I think everyone's here. Peter,